Chapter 55. Saying one thing, meaning another. Mr. Edward pondered as he noticed the girl staring at him with bright eyes. What did she want? Did she want him to help her? Did he really seem like a pushover to her? Despite thinking this, Mr. Edward lowered his gaze indifferently and said, "Yes, you're right." With his approval, Mila, who had been weighing the pros and cons, was slightly taken aback before making her decision. Originally, she had wanted to protect butler Toby, since he was her own person. But since Mr. Edward had spoken, she dared not defy him. Otherwise, if Mr. Edward pursued the matter, it wouldn't be just about the meal. Mila immediately turned to butler Toby and reprimanded him. "Butler Toby, what's the matter with you? Can't you even handle such a small task? You've wasted my trust in you. Did you assume my sister is not rational enough to tattle on you, and that's why you bullied her like this? If Ella hadn't discovered this today, I would still be kept in the dark." Butler Toby, having served Mila for many years, immediately understood the situation and quickly bowed his head. "Madam, it's my fault, I was negligent. You can punish me as you see fit." Mila immediately said, "Then I'll fine you 3 months' salary." Butler Toby nodded directly. "Yes, I have no objections." After all, Mila would punish him publicly but compensate him privately. They acted in concert, seemingly punishing butler Toby, but was this a light punishment to let the matter slide? Ella felt a sense of grievance, thinking that at least butler Toby would suffer some consequences, but in the end, it was just a financial penalty. She was about to say something when she heard Mr. Edward suddenly speak. "Madam." Mila was startled and immediately looked at him. "Mr. Edward, is there something you need?" Mr. Edward put down his chopsticks and spoke coldly, yet with an air of authority. "A servant who lords over his master is not someone we want in the Edward family." Mila was stunned. Butler Toby was the first to react, his face turning pale instantly. "Sir, Mr. Edward." Mr. Edward stood up, pulled out his chair, took the napkin on the table, and elegantly wiped his hands and mouth before saying, "You have 2 hours to leave the Edward family." Then he turned and walked away, not giving Mila any chance to speak. Butler Toby's legs weakened and he fell to the ground, no longer as composed as before. Alexander glanced at Mila and said, "Send it back again." Mila clenched her fists tightly but still smiled and nodded. "Alexander, this is my fault. I visit my sister every day, but when she's eating, I'm also eating, so I didn't notice. Don't worry, the meals for my sister will not be a problem from now on." Upon hearing this, Alexander's expression finally softened. He held Mila's hand. "You've worked hard with the household affairs." Mila lowered her head and smiled faintly. Butler Toby was dismissed, and hot meals were brought over by the servants. The nanny in the courtyard saw this and her face turned pale with fear. Ella glanced at her but didn't pay attention and continued eating with Sophia and her mother Jasmine. After the meal, Ella stood up, but her phone suddenly rang. She looked down and saw it was a call from Mr. Gold. Chapter 56. What do you do for a living? Ella immediately took her phone and walked to the courtyard to answer the call. On the other end, Mr. Gold's voice came through. "Ella, it seems like something's off with Judgia." Ella quickly asked, "What's going on?" Mr. Gold explained, "Judgia has suddenly become extremely virtuous, and it's giving me the creeps. I've been with my wife through the ups and downs of our business, and even if our love has faded, there's still family bond. I can't divorce her. So, we need to resolve the situation with Judgia as soon as possible." Ella nodded. "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." "Ella, I'm at the Enchanted Club right now. Why don't you come over so we can discuss our strategy?" Ella hesitated. "Well, Ella, I've already paid you a deposit, and now you're hesitating to come. Don't tell me you can't complete this task." "Of course we can complete it. You can trust us with the tasks our studio takes on," Ella immediately assured him. "Wait for me at the Enchanted Club, I'll be there soon." After hanging up, she looked at her leg. Even though she was injured, she had to go out again. Sigh. Who told her she was poor and lacked money? If she wanted to live freely, she first needed financial independence. With this thought, she mustered her strength and hobbled out with determination. As she reached the gate, about to leave and find a taxi, she suddenly heard the sound of a vehicle behind her. Ella turned around and saw Mr. Edward's low-key yet powerful black car slowly approaching. She quickly moved to the side to let them pass. Unexpectedly, the car stopped next to her, and the window rolled down to reveal Mr. Edward's face. The feeling of aloofness and distance swept over her. But for some reason, Ella felt that this chief was actually a bit cold on the outside but warm-hearted. After all, in the Edward family, he had helped her out more than once. Ella smiled and waved at him. "Chief." Mr. Edward glanced indifferently. "Where are you going?" "To work." Mr. Edward's eyes deepened. "Truly work?" She blinked. "Of course, I am a fine young person. I love learning and labor, working hard to make money." Mr. Edward's lips twitched. Ella leaned forward and tentatively asked, "Chief, how about you give me a ride? I'm going to the South Second Ring area." Mr. Edward directly refused. "I'm going to a meeting, not on the way." "Oh." Ella was disappointed and scratched her nose, then saw Mr. Edward about to roll up the window. She quickly said, "Chief." Mr. Edward turned his head. Ella smiled, revealing the dimples on her cheeks and two little tiger teeth. Her smile was like the sun, bright and dazzling to Mr. Edward. Then, he heard her words, "I've never had a chance to say this to you, but, thank you." With that, she turned and continued walking. After a few steps, she suddenly heard a voice from behind, "Get in the car." Ella. Although she didn't understand why Mr. Edward had suddenly changed his mind, being able to save on a taxi fare was definitely a joy. Ella quickly turned around and got into the car without hesitation. She sat down cheerfully and heard the man ask absent-mindedly, "What do you do for a living?" Chapter 57. It turns out it really wasn't on the way. What do you do for a living? The profession of mistress persuader was not very common. She pondered for a moment, was about to explain, but Mr. Edward's phone suddenly rang. He answered, and the voice on the other end said, "Mr. Edward, the shareholders are all here, waiting for you. When can you come to the company?" Mr. Edward heard this and thought for a moment. Ella suddenly realized that Mr. Edward had really been going to a meeting and it wasn't on the way. Edward family's company was in the north of the city, while she was going to the Enchanted Club in the south. She quickly said, "In that case, I'll get off here. You should go to your meeting." Before she finished, Mr. Edward glanced at her and then told the person on the phone, "I'll be there in half an hour." After hanging up, Mr. Edward leaned back, closing his eyes to rest. Ella. She was trying to be considerate and let him off the hook, but why did he seem unhappy about it? But then again, the man's thoughts were always hard to guess. With that in mind, she didn't speak. The car continued to head south. But as they drove, the traffic started to get congested. The driver said, "Sir, the navigation shows there's an accident at the intersection ahead. It's estimated that it will take a long time to clear, and if we continue this way, you definitely won't make it to the company in half an hour." Mr. Edward heard this and lightly raised his eyes. Before he could speak, Ella interjected, "Then you should just turn around at this intersection. I'm almost there and it's just a few hundred meters to walk." After saying this, she immediately pushed the car door open and jumped out. No matter what, Mr. Edward had already been kind enough to drive her here. She couldn't delay his meeting time. Thinking this, she hopped and walked, waving back at Mr. Edward as she moved. "Chief, you should go to your meeting." Mr. Edward. He had wanted to say that it was fine to be late for a while, but seeing her like this, he didn't speak up. Watching her walk for a bit, Mr. Edward instructed the driver, "Turn around." The driver nodded. But just as he was about to turn, Mr. Edward suddenly said, "Wait a minute." The driver quickly applied the brakes. Could this girl be any more careless? She had left her phone in the car. In this day and age, people basically didn't carry cash when they went out. Without her phone, she probably wouldn't even be able to find a ride home. Mr. Edward tentatively looked up and saw the girl's figure not far ahead. Without a word, he pushed the car door open, picked up the phone, crossed the pedestrian path, and quickly walked towards Ella's direction. Although the girl was limping, she had managed to walk a few hundred meters in a short time. He quickened his pace to catch up. As he got closer to her, Ella suddenly turned and entered a building beside her. Mr. Edward was slightly startled, looked up, and realized it was the Enchanted Club. He stood still, his face instantly darkening. He had trusted her so much, thinking that she was coming to work and kindly driving her here, but he never imagined that she was coming here. Coming here, what else could it be for? She was still involved with that so-called Mr. Gold. Chapter 58. Run. Mr. Edward felt a surge of anger rise within him. He clenched his fists tightly, emanating a chilling aura of murder. The next second, he scoffed, his eyes devoid of any emotion. How could he have believed her words, thinking she would reform and behave properly from then on? There's a saying, old habits die hard. That's exactly what she is. He narrowed his eyes, wondering if he had misunderstood her. So, without saying a word, he followed Ella into the club. Ella walked confidently forward, took the elevator, and went straight to the 8th floor. When Mr. Edward reached the 8th floor, he saw Ella knocking on the door of room 818. The door opened, revealing Mr. Jin's face. Instantly, Mr. Edward's face darkened, like a storm cloud ready to unleash fury. His piercing eyes locked onto the room, and upon seeing Ella enter familiarly and cautiously close the door, his anger grew like a raging wind. She was actually deceiving him. His restless emotions swelled within him until he could no longer control them. He had always been subtle when speaking to her, believing that mentioning their relationship as lovers would make her feel awkward. But now, without a second thought, Mr. Edward strode forward and kicked the door open. Ella followed Mr. Jin into the room, and the door closed. Mr. Jin seemed anxious. Is your approach too gentle? Jia isn't disappointed in me, instead she's getting worse. Is your studio even taking my case seriously? Before he could finish, Ella chuckled. Mr. Jin, don't rush. I haven't been neglectful, something really came up. Look at my leg, I fell from upstairs and it's broken. But even so, as soon as I got your call, I rushed over. Plus, your situation needs to be handled slowly. You need to give me the details so I can make a proper judgment. As she spoke, she lifted her leg to show him. But in doing so, she bumped into a nearby chair. Her toes hurt so much that she gasped, then slowly crouched down. Seeing her condition, Mr. Jin instinctively reached out to support her arm. Ella, are you okay? At that moment, the room door was kicked open. Bang! Ella, astonished, bit her lip and turned to see Mr. Edward, filled with, entering. Ella was slightly stunned and instinctively shouted, Chief, why are you here? Before she could finish, Mr. Edward, after seeing the two of them, frowned and stepped forward, grabbing Mr. Jin's collar and punching him hard. Mr. Jin was stunned, seeing stars, his cheek swelling up. He pointed at Mr. Edward, angrily shouting, Who are you, to just hit people like that? I'm the one hitting you. Mr. Edward muttered under his breath and moved forward again, ready to throw another punch. Ella snapped back to reality, rushed forward, and hugged his waist, shouting to Mr. Jin, Run. Mr. Jin came to his senses and turned to flee. Chapter 59. Chief, you're misunderstanding. Mr. Edward advanced, his face dark, looking relentless. Ella clung to him, shouting, Chief, what are you doing? Can you calm down? Mr. Edward stood there, his hands like iron claws on hers, and with a slight force, she was pushed away. Free again, Mr. Edward moved towards Mr. Jin. If Mr. Edward continued to assault his client, Mr. Jin would surely hold them accountable. Thinking this, Ella tried to hold him again, but he pushed her forcefully, causing her to slam into a table. Her waist hit the corner of the table, a sharp pain spreading throughout her body. Ouch! My waist, my leg. Ella gasped, the pain so severe that cold sweat broke out. Clutching her waist, she stood up and noticed Mr. Edward had halted his steps. Ella, enduring the pain, approached him again and hugged him tightly. Chief, don't be impulsive, let's talk about any issues calmly. This time, Mr. Edward didn't push her away. In the corridor, Mr. Jin entered the elevator, the doors closing. Mr. Edward couldn't chase him anymore. Ella sighed in relief, her arms slowly dropping. She frowned, looking at Mr. Edward's back. Chief, what's wrong with you today? Her tone was harsh. He had stormed in and beaten up her client, wasn't that just unreasonable? But to her surprise, the man slowly turned around. His face, cold as ice, showed no emotion, his gaze seemed to freeze her. Ella frowned, about to speak, when Mr. Edward spoke slowly. "Ella, you deceived me." Ella was startled. "What did I deceive you about?" Mr. Edward sneered. "Such bad behavior, deeply ingrained. Do you really enjoy doing these shady things?" Ella was even more confused. "What are you talking about?" Seeing her feign ignorance even now, Mr. Edward's anger intensified. It seemed to break through his restraint, making him explode with rage. He stepped forward, grabbing Ella's collar and pulling her close. Ella felt her neck tighten, involuntarily standing on tiptoe. The next moment, the man's cold face loomed large in front of her. His hot breath, mixed with a faint scent of grass, fanned her face. His deep eyes swirled with raging fury. He spoke slowly. "Being someone's mistress, is that so glorious? Let me tell you, a lady of the Edward family will never allow herself to sink so low." "Mistress?" Ella's eyes widened in shock. "What mistress?" But the next moment, it all clicked. This man had disliked her from the first meeting, repeatedly warning her not to tarnish the Edward family's reputation. She had thought he was referring to her kissing him. But now, she understood. Mr. Edward had mistaken her for Mr. Jin's mistress. Ella snorted coldly. "Chief, you're misunderstanding." Chapter 60. "Chief, are you jealous?" Ella felt wronged and angry. It turns out that Mr. Edward's recent disapproval stemmed from this. Angry that he never bothered to ask her about it. But then again, what was she? Just the granddaughter of a foster daughter in the Edward family, with no real connection to them. So why would he care about what she was doing? Or trust her character? She clenched her fists, enduring the humiliation to explain to Mr. Edward. Because she didn't want any misunderstandings between them to cause unnecessary trouble. Taking a deep breath, she said, "I'm not his mistress, I'm..." Before she could finish, Mr. Edward coldly interrupted, his eyes dark. "I don't need to know how much affection you have for him. I'm warning you, now, immediately, cut off all contact with him." Ella's anger flared up. "Enough of this guy." She looked up with restraint. "Can you listen to my explanation?" "For what?" "Another excuse for your immoral behavior and twisted values." Mr. Edward was uncharacteristically furious, his usual polite demeanor gone. Even he wasn't sure where this rage was coming from. Just seeing that Mr. Jin with his arm around her waist had ignited an unquenchable fury. Thinking of this, he reached out, gripping her chin tightly, forcing her to look at him, his voice harsh and cold. "Ella, I'm telling you, I have 1,001 ways to ensure Mr. Jin never comes back to you. Do you choose to leave him, or for him to leave you?" With those words, a bloodthirsty aura emanated from him. A suffocating anger blocked her chest. Immoral, twisted values. Those words felt like a slap to Ella's face. 8 months ago, she was kicked out of the orphanage because of these words. And now, Mr. Edward was rubbing salt into her wounds. The stinging pain spread through her heart. Anger grew within her. She lifted her head, feeling her chin might break. Her eyes reddened, and she suddenly sneered, grabbing Mr. Edward's wrist. "Chief, all this talk, at the end of the day, aren't you just jealous?" That one sentence made Mr. Edward's pupils shrink. As if hit by a mortal blow, his body stiffened, and his grip on her chin loosened. Ella didn't back down. Stepping forward, she placed both hands on his shoulders, tiptoeing to get closer to him. The warm breath of the girl was near his nose, and then Mr. Edward heard her sarcastic, self-deprecating voice, as if to capture one's soul. "Chief, your sensitivity and excitement about me and Mr. Jin, could it be that you've fallen for me?" Mr. Edward was like a man struck by lightning, instantly shocked. His lips moved slowly. "Don't talk nonsense." "Nonsense." Ella moved closer again, almost clinging to him. "You dare say you didn't feel anything from my kiss? Otherwise, let's test it now." With that, she closed her eyes, her lips curved into a rogue smile, and she leaned in to kiss him. Chapter 61. She's actually very fragile. Mr. Edward squinted his eyes, his mind completely blank. The girl's lips suddenly pressed against his. The warmth and delicacy made him feel like he couldn't catch his breath. But his strong self-control made him suddenly realize what he had done, and he swiftly pushed her away, sending her crashing into the wall behind her. Mr. Edward stared at her, his eyes flickering with incomprehensible emotions. Ella felt a sharp pain in her back. The man's push seemed to be with full force, making her feel like her internal organs were dislocated. Yet, she didn't feel the pain on her body. She stubbornly stared back at him. She knew her actions would certainly escalate his anger. He wouldn't let her off easily. But she was really furious. So much so that she had completely lost her reason. Even more furious than 8 months ago when she was misunderstood. She didn't regret teasing this man just now, even if a storm was coming. But what she never expected was the man in front of her, unpredictable as ever, stood there staring at her for a while, then suddenly turned and strode away. Even his departure seemed somewhat embarrassed. In the private room, for a moment, only Ella remained. She stood there, thinking about what had just happened, breathing heavily. Furious and scared, she didn't have time to think about Mr. Edward's expression. She just slowly slid down the wall to the floor. She crouched there, extending her arms, hugging herself tightly. Tears finally couldn't be held back and streamed down. Sorrow, sadness, anger, various complicated emotions finally made her drop her disguise, becoming that sensitive and vulnerable orphan. Not knowing how long she cried, her phone finally rang. She jerked her head up, walked to the dining table, picked up her phone, and saw it was Mr. Kim calling. She answered immediately. Mr. Kim's voice came through. "Ella, what's going on? Who was that guy? That was too much. My tooth is loose from being hit." Ella quickly explained. "I'm so sorry," he misunderstood. "Where are you? I'll take you to the hospital now. We'll cover the medical expenses. Whatever compensation you need, I'll cooperate." Mr. Kim reluctantly replied, "Do I need your medical expenses? Forget it. Just manage your boyfriend and explain clearly. Don't let him suddenly pop out and hit me again. I'm getting old, I can't handle this." "Boyfriend?" Ella was about to explain when Mr. Kim spoke again. "Today is over, I'll talk to you another day. I'm going to the hospital." "Okay, be careful driving, Mr. Kim. I'm really sorry about today." After hanging up, Ella sat dejectedly in the private room. What now? As she pondered, a voice suddenly came from the doorway of the private room. "So you're the mistress, you actually have the nerve to stay here. Watch me beat you to death today." "Ella, what's happening today? One after another showing up. Do they think I'm just a weakling?" She stood up, her eyes darkening. She moved her wrist, and saw Judgia freeze, standing there, then suddenly stepped back, ouch, and sat on the ground. What's this about? Chapter 62, Staging an Accident. As Ella was puzzled, she heard several footsteps approaching in the corridor. Judgia immediately shouted, "Officers, it's here. She attacked me." Soon, 2 police officers entered. Ella was taken aback by the scene. Her eyes widened, and she suddenly understood something. Judgia was on the ground, crying in pain. "It hurts, it hurts." One of the officers stepped forward, frowning as he asked, "What's going on here?" "The police, she hit me," Judgia yelled. The officers looked at Ella. "What happened here? What's your relationship? Why did you fight?" Ella bit her lip. She looked at the police. "I didn't lay a hand on her." Hearing this, Judgia immediately screamed, "Officers, you have to stand up for me. It's her, look." She then rolled up her sleeve to reveal a large bruise on her arm. "Not just my arm, I'm bruised all over, all because of her." The officers were feeling the pressure. Ella cautiously spoke, "Judgia, don't make false accusations. Why would I hit you?" Judgia started crying. "Why? Isn't it because of Mr. Kim? Are you so jealous that you resort to violence? Being a mistress, I've never seen someone as arrogant as you." That statement made the officers understand something. They showed a disdainful expression. One stepped forward. "All right, stop the crying. Come with us to the police station and explain what happened." At the police station, the officer sat behind a desk, taking notes. Judgia, next to him, cried while portraying herself as a victim. "Officers, I know being a mistress is wrong, but does that mean I'm not human? Hitting someone is wrong, and what stance does she have to hit me? You have to stand up for me. Look at the injuries on me, it must be a serious injury. She should be jailed for at least 3 to 5 months. And look at her attitude, not even a hint of remorse. I've never seen someone so defiant." Judge's crying made the police officer feel a headache. He looked at Ella. What do you have to say? Ella looked at Judge and sighed. I couldn't have hit her. The officer was puzzled. Why not? Judge screamed. How couldn't you? You even slapped me before. Listen, you need to pay for hitting me. And you want to steal my man? He's mine. Hearing the term my man, Ella felt goosebumps rising. She looked at the officer. Sir, can I speak to you alone? Judge immediately scoffed. Speak alone? What, you trying to bribe the police? Let me tell you, our police officers are the most honest and incorruptible. The officer glanced at Judge, also feeling her chatter was too much. All right, let this lady take a break first. As Judge was led away, she glared fiercely at Ella. You just wait. I'm telling you. Today, I'll make sure you can't get away with this. This hitting issue is far from over. When Judge left, the officer then looked at Ella. Go ahead, speak. Ella sighed. I have nothing to do with Mr. Kim like Judge said. I'm not his mistress. We have a business relationship. By now, she couldn't hide the truth. Chapter 63 Weird name. Otherwise, if the assault was confirmed, she would surely have to pay a hefty compensation. She didn't have any money now. The officer raised an eyebrow. Oh? Ella looked at him, firmly stating, my profession is a lover persuader. Hired by Mr. Kim, to persuade Judge to leave. I wouldn't assault a client. The officer was surprised upon hearing this. Ah? Meanwhile, in an office next to the police station, a man, dressed in a police uniform, but with his shirt buttons not properly fastened, revealing his tanned, sexy skin. His peach-shaped eyes slightly narrowed, a smile at the corner of his lips, leaning back in his chair, legs stretched on the desk, holding a phone, talking in a clear yet seductive voice. I say, Deep, why are you calling me? Are you missing me? On the other end came Mr. Edward's cold voice. Oblique, the old place. Oblique immediately sat up straight. My God, Deep, you're treating me to a drink. Has the sun risen in the west? Do you have something on your mind? Cut the chatter. Give me 30 minutes. Oblique quickly replied, okay. Seeing how urgently you want to see me, I'll hurry over. Don't worry, I'll be there soon. Before he finished, the call was disconnected. Oblique pouted, stood up, his tall figure exuding a masculine aura. He picked up his jacket, ready to leave, when there was a knock at the door. Come in. A police officer entered. Oblique, heading out? My little lover can't wait to see me. Alas, it's all because of my charm. The officer twitched his lips, handing Oblique a file. This case is a bit tricky. Oblique, take a look. She claims to be some kind of lover persuader. Oblique took the file and became serious. He quickly skimmed through the case, then tossed the file back to the officer. What kind of profession is that? Never heard of it, probably a scam. And this is a police station, we act regardless of who they are. Take this Judge for an injury assessment, investigate, if it's proven she was hit, then proceed as usual, if not, release her. The officer nodded. What about the two of them now? Oblique waved his hand. Let them contact someone to bail them out, then wait for the investigation results. We'll decide based on the outcome. The officer stood up straight. Yes. Oh, I have to hurry, or my little lover will be fretting to death, Oblique said, recovering his playful demeanor, as he walked out briskly. He drove all the way to the so-called old place, a private bar. He parked and walked in. At a glance, he saw Mr. Edward in the corner, drinking a shot in one gulp. The man's cold, aloof expression was tinged with a distant loneliness. Usually proud, he now seemed somewhat forlorn and tangled. Oblique strode over, tossing his jacket on the sofa. Oh, I'm just a minute late, and you look like a deserted lover. Mr. Edward glanced up coolly. Oblique immediately stopped teasing, laughing, and explaining. I got held up by a case. You know, there are all sorts of professions in this world. Today we picked up a woman, claiming to be some kind of lover persuader. The name's pretty odd. Chapter 64, a word that awakens the dreamer. After Mr. Edward emerged from the private room, he walked briskly forward. He didn't know what had just happened to him. When the girl's kiss landed, he actually felt a bit irresistible. His mood was extremely vexed, his face clouded with gloom. The violent emotions the man exuded made even the driver in the car feel terror. Having followed the boss for so long, he had never seen him this angry. But hadn't he just gone to deliver a phone to Ella? Why was he so furious? While pondering this, Mr. Edward got into the car. The driver didn't even dare to breathe heavily, then heard the man say, "Go to the bar." The driver was stunned, looking at the 7 or 8 missed calls from the company's secretary on his phone, and mustered up the courage to ask fearfully, "Sir, about the company. Move the meeting to tomorrow." The driver dared not say another word. Ever since the boss took over the group, this was the first time he had ever missed an important meeting. What on earth had happened? Upon arriving at the bar, Mr. Edward began drinking his sorrows away without a word. The girl's image lingered before his eyes. She was lively and clever. She was also kind and innocent. She was stubborn and strong. She was also enigmatic and unpredictable. This kind of woman had always baffled him. Mr. Edward gripped the wine glass tightly. In front of him appeared the look from today that had gripped his heart. That look she gave him after he scolded her, with determination and distance. As if from that moment on, she would draw a clear line with him. No, they had always been distant, but whenever she looked at him, there was always a hint of cunning and a trace of trust. That trust vanished completely today. Thinking of this, his mood became even more agitated. He raised the glass in front of him and downed it in one gulp. Deep down, he actually wished she wasn't just a lover. But that time she admitted it herself in the private room with Jojo, and he couldn't think of any reason for her to be entangled with Mr. Jin and Jojo. Until Oblique's arrival. Claiming to be a lover persuader or something, named Ella. His hand holding the glass trembled slightly, spilling the wine. Then, he suddenly looked up, shockingly staring at Oblique with deep black eyes, his voice unconsciously trembling. "What did you say?" Oblique was startled. He backed away in fear. "I won't dare to flirt with you again, okay?" Mr. Edward stared at him. "That case." Oblique was confused. "Huh? What's it called?" Oblique thought for a while, then realized, "Ella. She's a lover persuader." A word awakened the dreamer. Ella. Lover persuader. Although this profession was new to him, at this moment, he suddenly understood the look Ella gave him today. That look of being hurt by his words, shocked, taken aback, incredulous, yet stubbornly erecting all her defenses, refusing to communicate anymore. Mr. Edward abruptly stood up. "Where is that girl?" "Oblique. At the police station, waiting to be bailed out, I guess." Without a word, Mr. Edward rushed straight out the door, leaving his coat behind. Oblique, her. How did he suddenly get stood up?